Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the fourth week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. We have some examples here on the table of recent things by and about Chomsky, and he remains an inspiration for what we try to do. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. No's notes are published on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing you can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a U.S. War on the World edition of News from Neptune because that is what's happening. I want to talk about the war in Syria and want to talk about the trade wars and metaphorical wars that are accompanying the American murderous wars around the world. And we'll begin with whatever's on David Green's list.
Okay, well, I've got 8 things, although one of them is sort of left over from last week.
Okay.
But a couple of them sort of have to deal generally with the situation in Israel-Palestine. One was provoked, as you know, by an interview that David Johnson and his colleagues on the World Labor Hour did on WRFU did last Saturday morning, early afternoon, with Daniel Biss, the gubernatorial candidate, and Joel Reinstein, who heads up a local socialist group, quizzed Biss very honestly after Biss made some very good comments, of course, because I think he's a good, solid social democrat or Keynesian democrat or sort of leftish democrat about the BDS movement and his opposition to BDS and his support for the repression of the BDS movement in this state. There was a good honest, I think, back and forth. Well, not really honest on Biss's part because he basically avoided being held accountable for what BDS really is and what it does. And my comment, which I made on the piece list, which you can read, in their archives if you wish, or if you haven't, really just had to do with the pertinence of this debate and whether or not the future of the Palestinian movement is with the BDS movement or is with the feminist intersectionality movement, which apparently supports the Palestinians now but doesn't really do a whole lot about them. And just to reiterate what I've said about Biss in the past, he represents a district which is heavily Jewish. You go down Skokie, you go down Dempster Avenue in Skokie, you see that, and into Evanston, and like I have been saying, people like Biss, if they actually do support two states, can actually do things, especially with their fellow Jews, to move the debate over what it is that Jews who claim to support Israel and two states could actually do for that, instead of just acceding to what Israel has been doing for the past 50 years, which is what the Jewish community has been doing in this country. The liberal Jewish community has been doing for the last 50 years. And at the same time, we see a Pew survey coming out showing that liberal and democratic Jews support Israel less and less. In fact, they say they support the Palestinians just as much, if not more, than they do Israel during the Netanyahu era, in which Netanyahu, especially in relation to his conflicts with Obama, with the supposedly liberal Obama, which many liberal Jews supported, they didn't like that too much. But still, the numbers are pretty low. We're talking about 30% who might support Palestine and 27% who might support Israel. Who knows what it means? The moneyed interests and the powerful interest in the Democratic Party haven't moved one whit towards genuine support for the Palestinian people, and it would be good if Daniel Biss put in a word for what that might mean. So the poll results of Jewish opinion on these matters are interesting. They're summarized in a very short on Mondo Weiss and in a very short piece that was done on the Real News Network, about 3 minutes long. You can see what that data shows. Before you proceed into the rest of the world, let me just refer to a few things that popped up about Latin America, a continent which is purportedly a continent to our south, which we don't talk about all that much on this program, but is certainly part of, has been always and firstly an object of control by American elites since the founding of this country, especially since the Monroe Doctrine, which we learn about in school as if it's some great natural thing that, wow, Monroe had this doctrine. Let's control Latin America. There's Doug Henwood had a nice interview about Honduras with a woman, last name Cuffe, C-U-F-F-E. And he also had a brief statement from a man named Alexander Maine about the goings-on in Brazil. And throw in that, and the summary of that, the short version is that Trump's foreign policy in Latin America has been awful, even in relation to Cuba, where you think that Trump would have a little give as a kind of deal maker. Cuba, he has threatened to renege on whatever progress Obama made with Cuba. There was also a nice interview on the Real News Network with a guy named Brian Meir, who I know as a correspondent on the podcast This Is Hell, and he does some good reporting from Brazil, from Sao Paulo. And this is about Lula and about the criminalization of Lula and the corruption charges, which U.S. agencies are supporting in their own way, and which may prevent Lula from becoming the next president of Brazil or the next prime minister. Again, as he already was, in the wake of the coup against Dilma and the current reign of a clearly corrupt man who replaced Lula. So Latin American politics, corruption is one thing, but these accusations and the manner in which they're used is something else. And of course, Venezuela. The mainstream media, the New York Times, continues to demonize Venezuela while we sanction Venezuela. None of this is a good thing for the people to our south. Susan Rice, ex of the Obama era, had a kind of trademark editorial in the New York Times, sort of defining what the spirit, the spirit of our age ought to be, which is what the spirit of our age has always been, which is control the rest of the world and act as if we're high-minded in doing so. That's only to mention, actually, I've got a new hobby, Carl, and that's messing on Wikipedia. So I went in there. I'm an editor now. It's easy. You can be an editor too. That's what Wikipedia is doing. Wikipedia was referred in the first line of Susan Rice's entry as a public servant, and I changed that to political operative. So I actually had changed it to something worse, but I changed my mind. So I think political operative is good enough. I don't think that she should be called a public servant. Anyway, you can look at that editorial and see what this awful woman had to say.
You changed the description on in a Wikipedia article?
Yeah, well, in the Wikipedia article, her biographical article.
And got away with it?
Well, so far I haven't checked it. I just did that earlier this morning.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right, fine.
So you can do that. I changed Phyllis Wise's also. The thing about Wikipedia is if somebody makes an unsourced claim without a reference, reference, you can go change that. And they're not supposed to do that. So somebody said something nice about Phyllis Wise without a reference to it, and I just got rid of it. that's
Oh,
fair.
David.
It's fair game.
Yes.
Don't worry. I don't spend too much of my time doing this sort of thing, and it's to no effect whatsoever.
You're much better at it. My posts to Facebook are getting blocked these days by
no.
reasons, yes, that I have yet to. I haven't investigated this with Dr. No, so
Okay,
it's,
yeah. Well,
we'll have
sure-
to find out why that's happening.
I'm sure there's
being shadow banned, as we talked about last week.
There's a vast conspiracy. I'm sure there's a vast conspiracy that was
I would have
directed
thought so.
at both of us. And
It's called American capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So, just a few more brief things. I had a letter to the editor this morning, and sometimes I read a letter that I wrote and say, well, I could have said that a little more clearly. And the idea is that, just like I'm always saying, it's when people start talking about generational conflict, no, it's class conflict. When people start talking about competition between the states for jobs, no, it's class conflict. The whole country's engaged in class conflict. That's kind of what I argued in a more dense way in my letter this morning. But the News Gazette just keeps at this idea. I mean, I don't know. I don't really quite understand this kind of stubbornness, and it's an avoidance of facts. It's a willingness to take big dollar values and not put them into any context. To take population loss, minimal as it is in the state, but not put it into any context. It's just a bunch of silliness. But there was also an editorial in the News Gazette this morning about Medicare and how much elderly people pay out of their pockets and how much they get in Social Security, but it didn't bother to mention just the broken nature of our healthcare system and how expensive that is. We spend. If we're spending $4 trillion out of our $20 trillion GDP on healthcare, we could be spending anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion and getting better healthcare if we had the kind of systems that they had in other developed countries. My Amy Goodman, 2 comments for the week, one generally negative and one specifically positive. When Amy Goodman goes out to the Sundance Film Festival, watch out. She's never more sanctimonious when she's at the Sundance Film Festival. But she did a nice interview about a film called King, that is Martin Luther King, in the wilderness, about the last year of his life when, as people forget, he was basically being scorned, and a long segment with a lot of decent people. So if you don't want to watch it, I just read the transcript, but that's one positive out of Amy Goodman this week. Back to the New York Times, Angus Deaton, the statistician and public health person who has done a lot of the good research on what are called deaths of despair in this country, did a good article on extreme poverty in the United States. Usually extreme poverty is talked about in terms of the global south and countries. We assume that even anybody in this country, if they're eating and sleeping every day, must be living on more than $4 or $5 a day. But Angus Deaton finds that perhaps 5 million, close to 2% of people in this country, are living lives of extreme poverty. Now, maybe he doesn't account for the value of all the food they get at soup kitchens or the shelter that they might get, but there is an enormous, amazing, unconscionable number of people who have fallen through the cracks of the so-called safety net and will continue to do so. So that's looking at. And one thing I would note, if you look in the website Naked Capitalism, and I forget whether there's an article about this one. There is about Amazon.com, which I was talking about last week, and their willingness, their campaign to get to find the city that's going to most bow down to them and reward them. Naked Capitalism always had good articles, not necessarily the New York Times articles. They're better than that, about such topics, and good comments and an informed commentariat in regard to that. And just to conclude, the Amazon Sweepstakes. Apparently, the state of Maryland has offered to reward Amazon with something like $5 billion worth of incentives to move their operation there. And it's, I mean, I haven't, when I've dug a little bit and based on what I said last week, looking at what the absurdity of all this, it's just remarkable. People are well aware, that they're not going to pay as much. They're going to damage these cities in various ways, but you can certainly depend when Chicago, which is one of these 20 cities finalists, when they don't get it, the News Gazette editors will be blaming the corrupt state and the lack of bill. Rahm Emanuel and the Chicago city government has been handing money over to corporations for years, and it doesn't do anything for the bottom 50%. And we're talking about Amazon now the same way we were talking about Walmart 10 years ago. We have monopoly capitalism in a form in this country. It's just the corporations that are monopolizing it change over a period of 10 or 20 or 30 years. This is something I don't know whether it's appropriate to say boycott Amazon, but
Probably a good idea anyhow.
it probably is. It probably is, and that doesn't mean that something better is going to come along. That doesn't mean that other corporations aren't doing the same thing Amazon is. But Amazon is just they're the top dog because we have a system that likes top dog. That once someone gets to a certain point, they can keep going, and 10 years from now it'll be something else. But we have to change, of course, that system that creates these kind of top dogs. One way to do it would be to socialize the kind of things that Amazon does.
What an idea.
Or just to one small example that is like, whatever FedEx does, whatever UPS does, you should socialize all of that. The post office, the USPS, should be doing all of that. Paying good wages, doing a good job, just doing that. It shouldn't be subject to the manner in which FedEx and UPS go about doing what they do. These are public utilities, just like banking should be. We should have public banking as a public utility because it's the interest of the people, of the public, the real interest of the public to socialize these necessary functions.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune. David has given us a list of enormities from this last week. It can be discussed in the time that we have left, can at least be touched on in the time that we have left. There's one particular item from the week's news that I would like to spend some time on, and I must admit it's an issue that I haven't a good summary of in any sense at all, in part because it's ongoing. That is the war in Northern Syria. The war in Syria has been a major international matter for some time, ever since the Obama administration started it by taking the Arab Spring objections to the government in Syria and internationalizing them, we might say in the most gentle phrase that occurs, by finding some of the most fanatical terrorists in the Middle East. They found most of them in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and sent them into Syria in order to overthrow a government that Washington didn't like, or didn't like enough. That is the government in Damascus, the Assad regime in Syria, a legitimate government, but one that was not following orders from D.C. So they had to be killed. And the U.S., the Obama administration, sent killers in for the Takfiri or jihadist terrorists to attack that country. And the result was a vicious civil war that was brought to even a temporary close by the intervention of Russia, invited in to aid the government in Damascus, while the United States was busily trying to overthrow that government with an illegal presence, both of its own troops, U.S. troops, and also the terrorists that the U.S. had hired for all practical purposes. This horrific scene has now taken a new turn this last week with the invasion of the northern part of Syria by Turkish troops. This is in the immensely complicated set of relationships amongst the countries of the region, and also, more importantly, from the point of view of American policy, the constant war provocations against Russia that are the staple of American diplomacy, for lack of a better word, in the region. There's a lot to be said here. What is actually happening isn't even clear. The possibility of the Turkish troops coming in direct contact with American troops, for good or ill, is still a possibility on the table. But there are many other players in this particular game, to mix the metaphor terribly. But the fact that it was the Kurds who are the victims of the Turkish attack, the Syrian Kurds who are resident in northern and northwestern Syria, reminded me of an old story. The Wayback Machine has been on all week, and as we're trying to figure out what's going on here, I was reminded of an earlier appearance of the Kurds. And remember, of course, there are a lot of Kurds. There are Kurds and Kurds. The Iraqi Kurds and the Syrian Kurds both comprise a set of different political groupings. The grouping under attack at the moment are the Kurdish movements in what is called Rojava, the Western Kurdistan, from the points of view of Kurds, which is a very different political formation from the Iraqi Kurds, who just went through a U.S.-inspired, apparently, referendum that failed rather badly. But the situation in Kurdistan, Kurds are a numerous people divided into several states, and the Syrian Kurds have our attention this week, but they've been a matter of concern for American policy for a long time. It took me back, as I say, 20 years to an account that includes people still around. Here was the elder statesman of foreign policy, this is from 1996 now, Henry Kissinger, writing in the Los Angeles Times about the heroic Kurdish people. You know, when the Kurds are on our side, they're heroic, of course, and how American missiles in southern Iraq could not save the Kurds who had worked for America from the vengeance of Saddam Hussein. The U.S. busily trying to build up its case for the invasion of Iraq. Mr. Kissinger, of all people, he knows better than anybody about American abandonment of the Kurds. For it was Kissinger, as Nixon's security advisor, who visited Tehran, that is the capital of Iran, in May 1972, now remember this is Iran under the Shah, and agreed to do the Shah the favor of organizing a Kurdish insurrection against Saddam, with whom the Shah was having trouble. So here's the U.S. promoting war, as we have recently done in Syria, but in the 1990s, promoting war in Iraq. After all, we didn't like the Iraq.
1970s, I think you're referring to, right?
1972. Yeah, sorry, did I say 1990? Yeah. This the piece I'm reading. The piece I'm reading is from the 90s. The American championing, if that's the right word, of the Kurds occurred in 72, as the U.S. was supporting our man in Tehran, the dictatorial Shah that the U.S. had put into place.
The Kurdish leader, Mustafa Barzani, the Barzani family continues to dominate the Iraqi Kurds, believed implicitly in Kissinger's guarantee, and he even gave his patron 3 rugs and a gold and pearl necklace. Hey, we see Henry wearing that all the time, right? As gifts when Kissinger got married. The uprising was going great guns, literally, for 3 years, with the Kurds sustaining thousands of casualties. Then suddenly the Shah and Saddam Hussein patched up their differences, and the Shah agreed to have the CIA call off the $16 million operation. Arms and supplies to the Kurds were abruptly cut off, and Barzani's forces, the Iraqi Kurds, were left to Saddam's tender mercies. Thousands tried to flee into Iran and were sent back. Barzani wrote to Kissinger, "Your Excellency, the United States has a moral and political responsibility to our people." We're hearing the same thing from the Kurds this week. There was no reply then. In 1975, 3 years later, Kissinger was asked before the House Intelligence Committee how he could justify this betrayal. He replied, quote, "Covert action should not be confused with missionary work," close quote. In September, Kissinger was on hand to critique the latest betrayal. Saddam's army and intelligence agents swept into northern Iraq and went after, this is the 1990s now, and went after Kurds who had worked for the American government trying to topple him. At least 100 were executed. 2,100 were evacuated and flown to Guam, while they'd be safely out of the way of media until after our election, the election in 1996. But 3,000 to 4,000 who were not directly American employees were left behind in constant danger of arrest. Suddenly, no thanks to the U.S., the situation changed. The Iraqi-aided Kurdistan Democratic Party was driven back in a counteroffensive by the Iran-aided Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. At stake now was not just the fate of some misguided supporters of America, but the possibility of a proxy war between Iran and Iraq, which the Clinton administration finally sent Ambassador Robert Pelotro to try to bring the warring factions together. But in the Kurdish region, the memory still lingers of Henry Kissinger's dictum that covert action should not be confused with missionary work. Now, for all the Kissinger phrase has entered into the American political mythology, what we should be aware of from the cynical use of that phrase is the extent to which the American meddling throughout, to use a contemporary word, throughout the region is never in the interests of the supposed beneficiaries. It's not missionary work, it's covert action, and of course the covert action often becomes overt, finally in the greatest political crime of this century so far, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Covert action is not missionary work, and we see that again today. That's the American principle, and we see that again today in Syria, where covert action has led to the immensely complicated war that the U.S. has without any right or justification thrust upon Syria. So much about the Syrian war this week. The possibilities are very great. The difficulties are very great. And it will, in fact, be interesting, if nothing more, this week to see what comes of it.
Yeah. I came across somewhere in my reading or viewing or listening a reference to the fact that the Turkish military is a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Because Erdogan has put a lot of his, subsequent to an alleged coup attempt a year or two ago, whole mess. It's been I guess a couple of years since that happened. That the competent Turkish military people end up in jail, or I think I even read that there are like pilots and people at that who are under house arrest and are used to fly missions and then are put back under house arrest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
mm-hmm.
and
Yes,
so
I've heard
this particular whoever it was ridiculing the idea that the Turkish government could inflict serious damage on the Rojava Kurds, or maybe he wasn't ridiculing that, but he was sort of countering that. But then again, they've got planes that could drop bombs,
Right.
and the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, don't, unless they've got American planes. And America
Exactly.
is, what is the State Department's view on the Turkish Turkish incursion into this place in northern Syria called Afrin? What is the American response been to that?
The interesting point seems to be that there's a great division within the American government, with the Pentagon on one side and the State Department on the other. The Turks certainly have some reason to be concerned about the American policy, not just that it's unclear, but that the Turkish government, the Erdogan government, is looking at, as you say, a background of a major attempt to overthrow it. An attempt to overthrow it that was apparently encouraged, if not constructed, by the United States. So Turkey's sympathy with the United States is not very strong to begin with. And secondly, this particular invasion of northern Syria, the Afrin region, as you say, is prompted by the U.S. announcing that it was establishing a 30,000-member border protection force. The border protection force along the Turkish border, the border protection force being made up of Kurds. So now military action is not to be confused with missionary work, apparently, for the Americans. The threat of support for the Kurdish groups who are allied with groups considered terrorist within Turkey prompted this invasion of northern Syria. And the relationship, on the one hand, with the U.S., Turkey's relationship with the U.S. and Turkey's relationship with Russia are the fundamental determinants of what's happening, given that the U.S. and Russia are facing off in Syria, and the American government's policy is remarkably unclear, in part because it seems like different aspects of the American government are backing different groups within Syria.
Yeah. And it's understandable in a sense why it's unclear, because Turkey is, on the one hand, a member of NATO. And an aspiring member of the European Union, and on the other hand, it is accessible to Russia and China. It's diplomatically accessible to Russia and China. It can play off the major threats to American global hegemony against the United States. So maybe Erdogan is playing a dangerous game, but he's, in some sense, he seems to be sort of in the catbird seat.
Yes, exactly. And
as the great baseball announcer Red Barber would have said.
What is a good overall comment on the situation runs as follows: what is shaping up is an informal but very real Russian, Turkish, Iranian regional alliance against the USA, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. That this conflict in Kurdistan, the conflict in Rojava, takes place in the context of this overall contest, the overall framework of disorder, to paraphrase Henry Kissinger, that is established by the Russian-American standoff in the region. It is, in fact, Turkey's effective departure from NATO and the American alliance, and its acceptance of a certain Russian patronage that makes this overall conflict with Russia, Turkey, and Iran on one side, and the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia on the other, the sort of general determinant of things that are going on in the region. Even though the Kurds are outraged and are now whining about the Russian betrayal, they will come to realize that they did it to themselves, and their best chance for freedom and prosperity is to work with the Russians, because it's the American patronage of the Kurds that has produced this situation in the first place. That means that the Russians will be able to achieve with and for the Kurds what the U.S. could not, yet another very nice side benefit for Russia. And this is the sort of thing that drives them nuts in Washington, the success of the Russian actions, military and political, in the region. Syria, Iran, and Turkey now realize a simple thing. Only Russia stands between the crazy U.S. and Israeli plans for the region, basically plans for breaking up the region into statelets that can be carefully managed by the U.S., Israeli, and Saudi Arabian alliance. Absent Russia, there is nothing stopping the U.S.-Israel alliance from reigniting the good terrorists, the ones that the Obama administration sent into Syria from Saudi Arabia, and the Kurds, and use them against every one of them. This is the situation the Kurds find themselves in right now, and it's not at all clear which way the U.S. that has precipitated the matter will jump. The Turkish troops are nearing a town called Manbij, M-A-N-B-I-J, which has several thousand American special forces in it. The Turkish government keeps saying we're going to clear terrorists out of Manbij, and they don't say that that means they will not confront the Americans in Manbij. So that's why the lights are burning late in Foggy Bottom right now, and across the river in Arlington too, as the Pentagon and the State Department try to work out their relationships between their various partisans in the region, and the outcome is not at all clear. I think that the nature of the Turkish invasion, as David explains, peculiar as it is, continues. The Turkish invasion continues, and a relationship between Turkey and the United States is not at all clear. Erdogan and Trump spoke on the phone last week, and the two sides gave very, very different accounts of how the conversation went, or even what the positions of the two sides were. So the matter is very much up in the air, and as clotted as my presentation is, it has nothing on mainstream media, which is unable to try to give you any real account of what's going on at all.
And the question is,
listen,
where do you get to? You know, I can't say that I actually work very hard to reveal the daily events and what's being said and what's being done, either on the ground or what diplomats and State Departments are saying about it. I don't know whether what's the daily newspaper or what's the website or what's the. I watched the Real News Network, and they've had a couple of good guests giving elaborate accounts in the last week of what's been going on in Northern Syria, but I didn't come away with it with a strong feeling about how things are going to actually go.
Well, and I think the reason
more like here's the scorecard, you know.
And I think the reason for that is that the way things will actually go will depend upon the U.S. position. And right now there are at least two U.S. positions, one favoring Turkey and the other favoring the Kurds. And the U.S. attempt, it's really the Pentagon's attempt to enlist the Kurds, the way Kissinger did, 40-odd years ago, is ongoing, while the State Department is attempting to repair relationships with Turkey. So
Rex Tillerson
and Trump's in Switzerland.
So Rex Tillerson made this speech at the Hoover Institution in California, which was commented upon from the left as a pretty threatening kind of American American interventionist kind of speech. Did you have a different take on Tillerson's speech than many of our quote unquote friends in the critical foreign policy community, such as it is?
No, the point of that speech was that the U.S. had not given up its demand that started the civil war in the first place, that the Assad government go.
Yes.
That the U.S. is renewing its demand of the Assad government to go. The tactics have changed a bit. The American tactics seem to be in Syria as elsewhere in the Middle East, a balkanization. Break it up into smaller pieces, and then we'll be able to control each of the smaller pieces better. That seems to be the American notion right now. The problem is that the American government is unclear enough about which pieces it wants to sponsor, that the breakup is proceeding in the form of war. The State Department's backing Turkey, and the Pentagon backing the Kurds, and Turkey just attacked the Kurds. So Tillerson's point, the American point, which does remain the same, the American policy throughout the region remains what it's always been: exert control over all these political groups that have some control of the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. But the American position is contradictory to the extent that they're backing different horses, and the horses are fighting, so to speak.
But it's worth noting that, from what I understand, in the midst of all this, the Syrian government, Assad, the relationship between them and the Syrian Kurds, that are American allies, is not a bad one. It's a sort of coexistent one, and that I'm not sure what that means in active terms, in terms of what really goes on between Damascus and Rojava in a very different part of Syria. But that just complicates it in some ways. But of course, the Kurds have thrown in their lot to a certain extent, obviously with American support, including American military support,
exactly.
American weapons and so forth, which was to the advantage of Assad in the sense that they defeated ISIS with those weapons. But the question is, which way forward, quote unquote, forward?
The Kurds in Syria were part of the civil war in the sense that they used the occasion of the American-sponsored civil war against the Damascus government to establish more of their own independence within Syria. That's gone on for a while, and particularly the self-organized groups in Rojava have taken on the governmental responsibilities in the region that the Damascus government was unable to exercise in the midst of the civil war. What happened this week was that the Kurds in Rojava suddenly said to the government in Damascus, hey, we've been invaded, your country has been invaded by the Turks. Come and help us against the Turks, and we'll settle back down into being a province of Syria. This is what the Syrian Turks said. That's a big change, because they were not at all willing to be a province of Syria. Now that they're under attack from Turkey, an enemy of the Damascus government, the Kurds suddenly want the Damascus government back on their side. Of course they do. They thought they could rely on the Americans to defend them against the Turks, and that question is still open, but it certainly isn't happening so far. It is an immensely complex situation where the American position is, as I say, complex itself.
Well, because Russia is supporting the Turks.
Well, yes and no. As you pointed out early on, Russia is, Turkey is an American ally through NATO. What Turkey has been doing, and when we say Turkey here, we mean the Erdogan government, because as you pointed out, there are contradictions within Turkey on this on these matters as well. What the Erdogan government was doing was, in a sense, playing Russia and America against one another, and have now done a deal to some extent with Russia, at least in terms of suggesting what the outcome should be. Russia has a major base just on the coast, just south of the region invaded by Turkey. Russia controls the airspace around that area. Turkey could not have invaded Afrin, the region in western Syria, without Russian permission. Russian permission was forthcoming, and it's been suggested what Russia essentially did, not publicly, but privately, what it was suggested what Russia did was say, all right, Turkey can have the control of the region where the Kurdish border patrol that the U.S. wanted to set up was going to be based. If Damascus, the Syrian government, can have control of the Idlib region, that's the area just south of Afrin, the area between there and Aleppo, which was part of the Syrian civil war. That seems to be the permission that allowed the Turks to invade, or the Erdogan government to invade northern Syria, the willingness of the Russians to step back.
And of course, it bears repeating in this context that the thing that the United States fears most is kind of a free reign between Iran, Iraq, through Iraq, which Iran is now Iran's allies because we made Iraq Iran's allies by throwing out the old dictator and putting in a more friendly to the Shiite Iranians dictator. You keep going west through Iran into Syria, through the area that's been vacated, that has been defeated by ISIS, or that in which ISIS controlled, which apparently no longer controls, all the way through Syria to Lebanon and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So that's the pipeline, the sort of both the political and actually the sort of material pipeline. One of those things that the United States doesn't want to see linked up. It doesn't want to have this free passage through this region of the world, through the strategic region of the world.
And if we could sort of pull the camera back and look at the whole region in terms of the, not literally, look at the whole region, so to speak, with in the
There
context
you go again, being figurative, Carl.
Well, I probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
We had a map of the region we've been talking about that I think may have been put up here at one point. But what I'm suggesting is that the overall context, the big picture, is the ongoing American policy that is ordered always against the economic integration and independence of Eurasia. That, at this point, refers to the Russians attempting to establish a beachhead in the Middle East made up of Iraq, Iran, and Syria. That's the great threat from the point of view of the Pentagon, from the point of view of the American government, that has to be stopped. And it has to be stopped by using our noble allies in the region, Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So the whole imbroglio takes place in the midst of this overall American policy of trying to prevent the Eurasian extension into the Persian Gulf region that a vigorous Iran-Syria-Iraqi alliance would produce. That's what has to be stopped. That's why the U.S. is busily killing people in the region, to make sure that its enemies don't get together. The matter continues this week, and there are wheels within wheels throughout it.
And for those who say that Israel somehow undermines U.S. foreign policy interests for whatever reason, including not making a peace with the Palestinians, not making a just peace with the Palestinians, that what we've been saying only reinforces the idea that we still need Israel. We may need it in a slightly different way, but their army, Saudi Arabia's military isn't a match for Israel's military in dealing with regional affairs in a violent or at least threatening way.
That's a very good point, and brings us back around to
Yeah.
where you started, David.
Yeah, right.
You're watching. No,
Yeah. Sure.
Everything is connected, as was the old
Yeah.
SDS mantra. And in terms of talking about world politics, particularly about the American promotion of war and rumors of war around the world, that's certainly true.
Yeah.
You've been listening to News from Neptune. We have some time left. Should we change the subject in the last couple of minutes?
Well, just maybe to bring, thanks, Ethan. To bring it locally, I keep an eye. I mean, we're both, dare I say, former candidates for Congress in the 13th district. There's a
Yes.
You ran in the Green Party. I ran in the Democratic Party. There are 4 candidates in the 13th district. One of them is local, and another one we know well, Dr. Gill, and a couple too are farther to the west of us in this region. People are writing supportive letters to the editor, which don't say a whole lot about what these candidates exactly stand for, except that they oppose Rodney Davis. I keep wondering. You go on their websites. I mean, I look at their websites regularly. The local candidate, who probably could expect to at least carry Champaign County, John Ebel, doesn't really have a whole lot on his website in terms of what he actually stands for. And I'm sure this is a tactical choice on his part. He wants to be kind of a Rorschach test for people who just want a Democrat, any Democrat in there. He's trying to be a sort of attractive candidate, but not make too many waves, to get the support of both the Clintonites and whoever may be left of the Clintonites. And I think Dr. Gill assumes he's going to get some of those people. But I think Betsy Londrigan out in Springfield is hoping that she'll get many women to vote for her. You know how that works. And then there's another fellow, Eric Jones, out farther west. Nobody's bowling me over right now. Is anybody bowling you over?
What do you know about the position of these various candidates on U.S. war making?
Well, that's the
what
thing.
we've been talking about all day. David Gill is at least on record
Yes.
as saying he opposes those sorts of wars.
Yeah.
His predecessor, Tim Johnson, who was congressman before the current incumbent, was elected in support of American war making throughout the Middle East, and changed quite remarkably in office to the point that he was an opponent of those wars by the time he left office. Unfortunately, that tradition, which Johnson established, has not been continued by the current incumbent, whose name I keep forgetting. He's a very forgettable guy. But the question is whether he's actually opposed, whether the incumbent is opposed on these grounds by any of these Democratic candidates. David Gill, as I say, has said in the past that he's opposed to American war making in the Middle East. But as you suggested, there's some vagaries about the campaign.
He does so, and he does have I have to say, David Gill has a page on his website in which he says a lot of things about specific things about issues, including single payer health care, and he refers to his general suspicion of military action. He's not gone full in for a Chomskyan critique of, as you might find in the book Global Discontents, Conversations on the Rising Threats to Democracy, interviews David Barsamian has done over the last few years with Noam Chomsky, published last year, but interviews going back to 2013, in which, in fact, you can find a review of the situation with the Kurds and so forth, and many other things. But back to the issue at hand, I guess there's a reluctance of Gill to really distinguish himself as the anti-war candidate and put himself out there in a way that,
as he does on the single payer,
might attract people who are coming around to that point of view and say, yeah, as opposed to, well, I'll just be enough anti-war to not offend the anti-war people. I mean, I believe he's
think you're right.
opposed to war. I do believe he's opposed to war, but I
But-
believe his political calculation is to not present himself as, say, the way I presented myself
Yes.
4 years ago, when I basically said I want to bring all the troops home.
Which, of course,
I'm not being self-serving here. I'm just
I think you got it.
laying it out.
You got it just right.
Yeah.
And that's the reason. Instead of talking about the wonderful family life of all these candidates, we should be hearing much more about what their views are on literal matters of life and death, American war making.
As I was thinking rather harshly in my own mind, they don't all have pretty children on their websites, but a couple of them do. And I would like to ask them, is it more important, are the lives of your pretty children more important than the pretty children that we're dropping bombs on and droning in other countries, or the pretty children that are being hauled off or even killed by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories? That's a kind of an obvious question. I don't like to be impolite in raising such things, because I know that politics is politics, and we all have our consultants and our websites and so forth. I don't know why people think it matters as to the fact that you're a good family man or a family woman. That doesn't qualify you for office. Besides which, we're all human beings. Ain't none of us perfect.
And it is all very, very strange that these political campaigns turn out to be not a controversy about policies that the government would be following in regard to the economy and war, for example, things that will actually be voted on by the people we send to Washington, but about the cut of their jib, how they look and how they seem, whether they're a nice guy or not, or a nice girl. But I mean, this is silly. This is really outrageously bad and dangerous, and you can understand why candidates want to avoid taking positions on any of the important issues when the danger of offending people who actually have other views and the necessity for a discussion or argument about those issues would occur. The situation is quite outrageous. And it makes a mockery of the elections when the elections are supposed to be attempts to determine what sort of policies the government should follow. We don't get that. That's not what they're about.
I would give David Gill, I'm obviously sort of hedging my my words here, but I like David Gill, and I think he's basically saying some good things. I would like for him to be a little stronger on the foreign policy issue, but he does choose to promote himself on his website and his views. Not, he's a man who has, I think, 3 of his own children and 3 of his wife's children, and so he has as much right as anyone else to put up a whole bunch of children on his website. Maybe they're not as pretty as the other people's children. I don't know, but
the partial rule that I have put together for deciding how to vote after long arguments begins with vote against incumbents. They haven't done well, whether Republicans or Democrats or in some rare places members of the Green Party. They have not done well at all. Vote against them, throw them out, and instruct the people coming in that what the incumbents were doing was not good and they'd better do better.
In our local state assembly race, it looks like the incumbent isn't going to have any opposition either in the primary or the general election.
There's always write-ins. There are always possibilities.
Okay, well, we'll write you in. Okay.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 4th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. This has been a U.S. War on the World edition, with thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, What's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.